I'd like to take a moment now to introduce and spotlight two of our leaders for this series. First, I'd like to highlight today's presenter, Dr. Josh Packard. Josh serves as the research director at TriTank, where he partners with Future of Faith, the official research partner of TriTank, to explore trends shaping the future of the church. Additionally, Josh is the executive director of the Springtide Research Institute and a respected sociologist of religion. He is widely published, a sought-after speaker, and has devoted his work to understanding the changing religious landscape among young people and families. His insights help us to make sense of the shifts happening in church and culture today, and we are absolutely thrilled to have him with us. We're also joined by the Reverend Libby Tedder Hughes. Libby is an ordained pastor, a certified coach, and founder of Resonant Coaching, and one of our coaches for the Around the Table initiative. She brings deep experience in helping leaders and congregations discover clarity, creativity, and courage in ministry. Libby will be facilitating us in sessions 2 and 3, leading us into small group reflections and conversations around the research we are engaging today. Additionally, she will guide our third session in the series, introducing participants to a variety of practitioners who have started new ministries that appeal to young parents. And so before we get moving into Josh's presentation, there are a few quick housekeeping items. I'd like to let you know that on the slide that you're seeing, if you would like to, you can go to the full study that Josh is presenting today by clicking on that QR code. I'd also like to let you know that the webinar is being recorded, as you might have seen already. And we are also asking that you use the question and answer box or the Q&A box to submit questions for Josh's presentation. We also have the chat available for general comments and for you to make connections and respond to different prompts. And if you experience any technical issues, please send a direct message either to Janet or Miata in the chat, and they will assist you with your needs. And so as we prepare to transition to our presentation, I would like to invite you one more time to chat with us. I invite you to think about the young people that you know or those that you have seen, whether in your congregation, in your community, or even in your own family. And I'd like you to invite you to ask yourself, what is one hope or challenge you see them carrying right now? And you can just share a short word or phrase in the chat for what is one hope or one challenge you see young parents carrying right now. So thank you to you all. And now it is with great joy and anticipation that I turn things over to Dr. Josh, who will guide us through the key findings of the Young Adult Parents Research Project and what they mean for the church today. Josh, we welcome you.
Thank you so much, Nima. I'm looking at these answers as they pour in here. These are, man, it's there's so many, it's so hard to keep track of, but it's super interesting already, and really great to see, so many people interested in this topic and coming from all over the country. I even saw, as people were saying where they're from, I saw Leah chime in from Bedford. I used to live in Bedford, Texas, for a short period of time, and then lived in South Lake. Moved out there to go to middle school and high school. So it's really cool. And we've got a couple of people here from my organization, Future of Faith. I saw Lauren, who used to be with 1001 and is now with us over and as our research director. So love all the energy in the room. Love seeing these responses. So many really good things, overscheduled, too many expectations, trying to figure out just juggling everything. And I think this is such an important way to start off the conversation today, because we're going to end up very shortly here in just a few minutes. You're going to sort of drown in data a little bit. And it can be easy, I think, to lose sight of behind each of these data points are real people struggling with real things. I mean, sometimes we end up, when we talk about research, we end up talking about like them as though the people in the research are like another species altogether. But the reality is, like, every data point is a human being who's just trying to do their best to get through the day, in many cases, and ideally, try and string together a more good days than bad days, over the course of weeks and months. And that's especially true when it comes to parents. Everybody wants the best for their kids, and they're trying to figure out how to do that. So you're going to see a lot of these things coming up. A lot of the things that are already in the chat. We've got people worried about what's going on online, finding community, worried about loneliness for their kids. You're going to see all that stuff come up in the data, but I'm just encouraging you to go back to that list. Remember that there are real people that you thought of when you were dropping these answers in. So with that in mind, and as backdrop, make sure I share the correct screen, and we'll get rolling here. All right, there we go. As Nima said, I am the research director at TriTank Research Institute, and Future of Faith, the organization I helped to co-found, is the sort of official research partner at TriTank. And this is really the first project that we did together. And I say together, and not between TriTank and Future of Faith, but something I'm really proud of is that is just to underscore what Nima said at the beginning, that this is really an ecumenical effort. That this TriTank is Episcopalian. The ELCA is the largest Lutheran denomination, and of course PCUSA. And that's really cool to get to be a part of. So often the work that I do and that is done is either done completely outside of these denominational and institutional structures, or it's done just inside of one of them. And yet there are so many shared concerns. So please know that this is the first of the projects that we worked on, or one of the first, but there have been others since then, and we're continuing to push into more even as we speak. With the same group of people. So I just applaud PCUSA for being good ecumenical partners in that way. I think it produces some of these like really interesting conversations and interesting research results. For example, the one we're working on right now is about lay-led congregations, and the Methodists are also joining us. And so trying to figure out and even define what a lay-led congregation is, the whole thing before we even get started on the research. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. You're here to talk about parents. And the question here is what happens when nuns and ONESs have kids? So as you might have been, hearing a lot about, there's a lot of unaffiliated people now. We're going to touch on that. And they're getting to an age where they would normally have children. So let's take a look at how we're going to tackle this today. We'll go through an introduction, and then I will set the stage with some sort of big social trends that are helping to shape the larger field here, the sort of body of water that we're swimming in. And then we'll dive into these key findings before we get into future directions, places that we might have. And as Nima mentioned, there's Q&A available. Please make use of that. We're going to have time for Q&A at the end. There's probably 1,000 questions, some of which I'll get to hopefully, but I'm happy to, we've left lots of time at the end so we can try and address as many of them here as possible. All right, so what's the big introduction here? I'm a sociologist. Sociology, if you have any experience with sociology, it's probably that class that you took in college and you really loved, but couldn't figure out how to do anything professionally with it. And you're not wrong about that. Most of us that went on to become professional sociologists went into being a professor. That's what I did for a long time. And then of course most people don't major in sociology and they do other things. But the reason it's so compelling and worth talking about here is because it gives us a different perspective about the same information and the same stuff that we encounter. So most of what we do in the course of our daily lives is we make sense out of the things that we see from a pretty psychological perspective. We think, people act the way that they act, they behave the way they behave because they are a certain kind of person. They have, their personality or something about them drives them to make the decisions that they make. And that's not untrue. That psychology does play a big role in this, but there is also something to be said about the sort of social conditions that constrain people's perceived choices, what they are likely to do, and influences them in one direction or another. One of the ways we can think about this is about the forest and the trees. That you've heard that metaphor, I'm sure, before. They couldn't see the forest for the trees, and that's okay. Most of like when you walk around in your daily life in your ministry, you're super concerned about your tree. You got to make sure your program is running. You need to attend to that person who's going through maybe a stage of grief, or you need to celebrate with this person over here who just got a new job or whatever it is. You have to be hyper focused on just that tree so that you can do the best job possible to nurture it and raise it. My job is to pay attention to the forest. because there's really important things that happen at a forest level that impact all of our individual trees. And, so what I do professionally is through a variety of research methods, try and help understand, okay, what out there is just like normal everyday noise, and what are the things that are sort of big social trends that might matter, that are useful for us to understand so that we can attend to our trees well. And so that's the context that'll be coming at today from this idea of, how do we help to bridge this between the forest level trends, and the trees that we're tending to. I think that this distinction is really helpful because it helps us to understand where to act. If on the one hand we get these things confused and we think that big forest level trends are actually trees, then we go around trying to fix those things because the tree is ours to take care of. But if we understand that some things are beyond the capacity of any of us to take care of, but they must be responded to, then that means that we can put our energy into the correct places. We understand what is actually even under our purview. So I think that distinction ends up being critical, not just as a theoretical distinction, but as a point of action. And at the end of the day, all the research that we're going to talk about here, if it stays in this realm of interesting, is no good. We need it to move into the realm of action. And so as we go through this, we're going to be trying to keep that action lens right down to your ministry level in mind all the time. Now, I'm not a minister. I've never been a minister. I was just on a podcast this morning and somebody said, "What's the worst piece of ministry advice you ever got?" And I responded very quickly with, somebody once told me I should be a pastor. And that is a bad piece of advice. So I'm really glad that I did not take that. That I respect those rules. What the work that you all do is incredibly important. So please privilege your own knowledge over the data points that you're going to see here. I'm just trying to help provide some context. So what is that context? Well, there are a couple of big trends that we're going to discuss here: disaffiliation, childbearing, and trust being the big things that I think are going on at a forest level that we really need to pay attention to. And the first one is disaffiliation. You've seen probably plenty about this if you've been paying attention to any of the data that have been research that has come out over the last 10 years, probably from your own denominations even are concerned with this. You may have even felt this in your own pews. And this is really the move away, the move of people away from affiliating with a particular denomination or even a particular faith. So places like Pew and Gallup have been charting this for a long time. And now the number of US adults who claim no religious affiliation when they're asked in surveys, if they're Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, etc., there's that bottom category that says none, NONES, none of the above. And that's where we get the title for this presentation. Well, that number is now at like a third. Like a third of US adults claim no religious affiliation. And that has been on the rise for about 15 or 20 years, maybe a little bit longer. In the last couple of years, there's been maybe some hope here. It looks like those has leveled off. It's not like it's necessarily declining dramatically, but at least it is not increasing in the ways that it once was. So that's, I think, a good sign. But it's already had a dramatic effect in terms of reshaping the religious landscape. You see the headline here from Gallup from 2021 was the first time that church membership fell below the majority in this country since like in the last century, since these things have been tracking it, meaning fewer than half of people belong to a church. This is not something that had happened overnight. This is something that happened gradually over time. Assuming that my slide will, there we go. So it was just sort of like, really through attrition or people dying, actually, as membership was getting older, we saw the result in 2021 of what was sort of an inevitable trend, which is just fewer and fewer members. There are fewer and fewer people attending. There are fewer and fewer people claiming that they belong to any faith tradition at all. But this does not mean that they don't believe. I mean, I think the direct line that we have been sort of building and that you see a lot of alarmist headlines claiming is that, okay, well, look, church membership has dropped to less than half. The number of nuns is at an all-time high. Americans just don't believe in God anymore. They don't care about spiritual activities. That's not necessarily true. There has been some softening in those numbers, but those numbers have not experienced the same kind of decline as our institutional markers. And we're going to talk a little bit about why that is here in just a second. Nevertheless, it seems like we used to be able to swim in a water where, everybody sort of believed. You could reasonably expect that you wouldn't schedule things, you wouldn't sort of counter program Sunday mornings or schedule anything else on Sunday mornings because that was the time for the church. And that is just no longer the case. There's lots of things going on Sunday mornings. You don't know when you go out into sort of polite society, quote unquote, or at a PTA meeting or whatever it is, when you encounter strangers, you can't reasonably assume that they go to church or that they are Christian. And that would have been an assumption that your parents very easily probably could have made. Now, this is not evenly spread. There's some places where obviously these numbers are much higher, and some places where these numbers are much lower. This slide here, you see the frequency of attendance at religious service among all U.S. adults, and then broken down by category, and how much that has dropped just in the period of time during this study. This number comes from Gallup. Pew did some forecasting. You don't have to read all this or expect you to understand. I just want you to see that people are really trying to understand what this means for the future. And in Pew's various versions here, the 4 scenarios they put forth, in all the realistic ones, they see really the population evening out between the share of Christians and non-Christians, or in the ones that they think scenario 2 and 3 are the most likely, the population share of unaffiliated people being larger than the share of Christians by 2070. So it feels like we're moving to this very different kind of religious landscape, and that has been very much the case. There's a lot of really interesting things happening over the last really 12 to 18 months, 24 months. You may have heard about the Asbury revival. You may have heard about an uptick of, especially among conservative Christian young men coming back to church. So this is not to say that these data are entirely predictive. This is not a future that is set in stone. This is just the way that the data point us based on where we see the trends heading. So that's big trend number 1. The second thing that is kind of alarming is this trend about childbearing. So we're just simply having fewer children, and fewer people are opting to have children. As you see these findings here from the Carey School of Public Policy, there are 4.7 million more women who are childless than anticipated. This is from the winter of 2023. That's a lot. That's obviously a lot of people that we would have expected to have kids who are just not having them by this age. There are 9% more women 20 to 39 than in 2006, but 10% fewer have given birth. And 9.6 million fewer babies were born. Oh, wait, hold on. Oh yeah, we got through. Okay, just making sure that slide advanced. 9.6 million fewer babies. Well, of course, that, in a church context, that means fewer baptisms. It means, potentially fewer parents coming to church because they want their kids to get some religious education. It means fewer Sunday schools, fewer religious education classes, et cetera, et cetera. So this has a profound impact. It's a really important trend. There's obviously all kinds of political, economic, social implications outside of the religious sphere as well, but I'm not that expert, and that isn't today's presentation. In our own research, so the data we'll share here are of 25 to 39-year-olds. So the way that this works when we do research is that we go out and we look, we tell the company that fields the results for us that we want it to be, matching census levels for the population. So we have something that's representative, but we restricted it in this case to 25 to 39-year-olds who are having children. So when we put out the survey, the first question was, do you fall into this age group, and are you planning to have children? And that was like a screener question. And it really ended up becoming the first finding, which was that we had to disqualify 41% of the people from our study because they clicked, no, I'm not planning to have children. And so they didn't have children or not planning to have children. And so we booted them. That would be an all-time high. 41, if that number held. If 41% of 25 to 39-year-olds actually ended up not having kids, that'd be catastrophic in some ways. for culture. That number won't hold. Obviously, some people will change their minds. Some people won't change their minds and will end up having kids anyway. So there's a whole lot of things that go into that number, but still, that is a significant trend that is happening at the forest level. The last thing that is sort of coloring all of our work that I think most people have no idea about often is the way that we have fundamentally reshaped trust in this country since the 1950s. That we used to be a society that I would call a high trust society. We trusted all kinds of things. We trusted each other, certainly, but we trusted our institutions and our institutional leaders as well. That is no longer the case. So when we look at data from Gallup or Pew, lots of different, the General Social Survey, lots of places track this. What we've seen, again, is a steady erosion of trust. And when we talked about forest and trees earlier, you might be inclined to look at that bottom category. Organized religion fell from 65 to 36% just in the last like 40 or 50 years. But that would be to understand it at the tree level. And I really think the right way to see this is as a forest trend. If that were the only issue, if it was just organized religion that had lost trust and everybody else was doing fantastically, then this would really have to be a presentation about what you all had done wrong as an institution to cause that to happen. But that's not the case. Instead, what we see here is, I think, pretty clear and compelling data that we're losing faith and trust in all kinds of institutions. In fact, every institution, which means that this is a forest level issue. You can't fix it. You didn't cause it. It's just a thing that you have to respond to. The reality is that now you are operating in a low trust environment, whereas 50 years ago, you were operating in a high trust environment. And I think that's important because those environments call for different tools. And this is, we can talk a little bit about what those tools are, but just to know that the things that worked in a high trust environment likely are going to be less effective in a low trust world. This extends to leaders as well. This is just the change from 2019 to 2023. So you can look at the change or you can look at the numbers, the sort of raw numbers. Neither of them are particularly good. And the way that Gallup asked this question was about ethics ratings. There's all kinds of different ways to ask about professionals. And in this case, you see clergy there at 32%, which is at or near an all-time low. Gallup releases new numbers every year. So it's in 2025, I'm not sure if the 5 data has come out yet, but in 2024, it decreased another point or two. Nevertheless, you see the same thing, right? Nobody's particularly high. Everybody's on the way down. We don't trust our institutions. We don't trust our institutional leaders. That is the environment that we're in as ministers. That's sort of what we're up against. Mark Malloch Brown said it this way. He said, a global trust recession is in full swing. To rebuild faith in our institutions, we cannot simply tell people to have faith in them. And I think this is well put. That also points out that this is not just happening in the United States. This is kind of happening all over the globe. I don't know that this is supposed to make you feel better or anything, but that is nevertheless the case, that trust is relocating from institutions into individuals. So let's look at what this means for parents. So that if those are the big trends, here are the key findings. There are 6 of them as we went through the research, and we'll take them one at a time. But before we get to them, let's talk just a second about the methodology. We did the first phase was an exploratory survey. That was over 3,000 US adults, which is more than enough that is needed to be representative. So we've got a pretty small margin of error. We took what we learned from that, took it back to our working group, came up with what we wanted to know more about. We dove deeper with some interviews with individual young adults who are either parents or thinking that they would become parents. And then we wrapped all that up in a phase 3 where we went out and did another survey of another 1,000 people. So the data here are pretty robust, all in between 2023 and 2024. And let's take these now, then the key findings one at a time. First, if things keep going this way, it looks like the faith is really like, in terms of faith transmission, that there really are some plans that it's going to stop or have to look very, very differently. You see here, this is a graph that shows us the interest in church for children's spiritual development and comparing Christians on the top to nuns on that bottom category. And I think, interestingly, what you're going to see on what you see on this graph and what you'll see maybe throughout the data here is that nuns are almost always very different than their religious counterparts, but that very rarely are they completely closed off to the idea of church. And so if we're thinking about this as like, okay, where is the mission field? Um, Sometimes, we can think like, gosh, the mission field is nuns. They don't even believe in God. Like we can't, like how are we possibly going to, turn them or like win them or be relevant to them? But what I think you're often going to find is that nuns are not necessarily completely closed off to the idea of coming to church and or bringing their kids here. So what you see in this case is that you've got like a third of nuns saying, okay, I don't particularly identify with a religious belief or faith, but I am interested in church for my own children and for their spiritual background, or rather development, which is fascinating. I mean, if I was a nun, I'm not sure that I would be like wanting to take my kids to church. It tells us like there's something going on there. Like these categories are not as cut and dried as we might like to think that they are. Um, and I think the other thing you're going to see throughout these data is that the second mission field are the parents who are already sitting in your pews. Just because they're there, we shouldn't be assuming that they are like locked in, ready to go all the time. That number of Christians who are interested in church for their children's spiritual development, if we look at the agree and strongly agree, that's like just a tick under 70%. I would have expected that number to be much higher, right? Like we would expect that Christian parents think that church is good for their children's spiritual development, almost universally. And while that number is high, 68 whatever percent is high, it's not as high as I would have expected. So again, more nuance there than what we might have thought. All right. It is necessary to believe in God in order to be moral and have good values. Christians are agreeing with this at just over half, whereas nuns only 17%. This is sort of indicative of where we're going to start to see the divergence is really in terms of how the faith is expressed or like the particular teachings here, as we try and find the role that the church might have and be able to play. Along the same lines, we can look at, are you interested in church for your kids' spiritual development? Do you plan to take your kids to church? Do you value traditional rites of passage at all? I mean, you see the nuns there in the blue line. It's just they're consistently below these other two, and I'll explain those other two lines here in a second. Kids feel connected. It's important that my kids feel connected to something transcendent. Ticks up just a little bit, but that's obviously the vaguest of religious language there. And the importance of kids being religious as adults. These trends now sort of mirror each other. What we've got in the gold line, and we broke out a lot of our findings this way, the gold line at the top and the red line in the middle are what we're calling active affiliates and inactive affiliates, because we're really interested in knowing like, okay, well, it's one thing to say on a survey that you're Christian or Jewish or Buddhist or whatever, in this case, Christian, but are you actually active? And so we defined active as people who claim a religious affiliation and attend services once a month or more. Which might feel like a low barrier for a lot of you, but we wanted just some indication that like, you were practicing this on a regular basis. And the inactive affiliates said that they attended services seldom or never. And so we were able to make some distinction between, without judgment of here around how people are living their lives, but really just to understand the differences between these two groups. And we see that there are distinct differences. I mean, the inactive affiliates, they look a lot closer to, in terms of their shape here of the data, they look a lot closer to the nuns than they do to the active affiliates, meaning that there's a lot of people out there who are sort of claiming affiliation, not particularly active, and not really making a whole lot of plans for how to pass whatever kind of faith it is that they have down to their kids. And we're going to get into why that is in just a little bit. In fact, MG here helps us on one of the interviews. I want to pass on the ability for them to make their own choices. If they are going to have a relationship with religion and faith, I want that to be something that they pick for themselves. We really don't want them to get pushed one way or the other based off of our opinions. It's a wild quote to me, because a lot of what MG, I think I understand what they're saying. And also I'm like, isn't that just parenting? Like, isn't the transmission of values and the things that you care about down to your children? I think that's what we call parenting, or certainly what most generations would have understood as parenting. But MG is really reframing this in a very different way than most generations have in the past. That parenting here is to create the conditions under which their children can be open and curious and have a tremendous amount of agency. And you can argue whether that's good or bad. I was just shocked to hear it come out in quite that way. Key finding number 2, parents are worried about a lot of things. This is where we get into the question that opened up the conversation today. You put so many of these really great things in the chat there. They're worried about a lot of things, but religion is often the least of their concerns. So if we look at the things that they've, how important are each of the following to teach your children? They say all these, of course, these are really important things. They want them to be responsible. They want them to work hard, be well-mannered, to help others, have empathy, be independent, creative, persist, have tolerance, etc. At the very bottom of that list. And I would say not just at the bottom of the list, but also significantly less than the others, is a sense of spirituality and religious faith. These are just not the things that they're most worried about for their own children. When we ask them specifically about worry, on a scale from not worried at all to extremely worried, you see some very pragmatic things. Being bullied, exposure to harmful content online, being kidnapped, getting beaten up, getting shot, parents with problems with drugs and alcohol, getting pregnant, trouble with the police, and then losing faith. These are just losing, like the faith issue is just not as immediate as the others. And one more in this regard, how important is it that each of your children do the following things as adults? Most of these sort of, I think you could group these fairly into the like, please get out of my house at some point and take care of yourself. These are the things that sort of dominate the top of the list. And then at the bottom, having similar religious beliefs, having similar political beliefs show up as things that are just not as important as the other things to them. There is, so when we look at these things in total, it's clear that parents have a lot going on, but that faith is just, if it's on the list, because a lot of times these are still ticking up around 3 or so on the scale, but they're not necessarily the things that are at the top of the list that are, I would say, like sort of keeping them up at night. The next finding: life is hard, and the church is not seen as a resource. So I think this is sort of related to the previous one here. So young parents' assessments of life challenges. We asked them this question and asked them to say how much they agreed or disagree with it. Life is generally harder than I expected it to be at this point. Now, remember, again, we're talking 25 to 39-year-olds who have said that they either have kids or want to have kids. So we're really talking about the sort of oldest of Gen Z, the youngest of the millennials, right in this like really tumultuous time of life where they've often had a lot of life transition. And that's not surprising. 20s and 30s are often about lots of things going on. But what is kind of surprising is that they don't seem particularly well prepared for it. As so many of them are falling into this strongly agree camp that it's harder than I thought it would be. Like I'm not as far along as I thought I would be. Things are not going as well for me and my kids as I would have hoped. If I have kids, or me and my family, or me and my spouse, if I have a partner. And we don't really see the church as a resource to do that. As we looked at more of the data, only 17% of young adult parents have been involved in a faith community in the previous 5 years. So they're going through all this stuff. Life is harder, and they're not going to church. And only 57% of people turn to that faith community to help them navigate these tough times. And we shouldn't assume that just because they're there that they found it to be useful, because 17% of those people who did turn to a faith community actually found that faith community to be unhelpful. So like that's a little bit of tree stuff that we probably need to clean up. And so the way I was thinking about this is that at a time when people are experiencing a lot of transition, trauma, and disruption in their lives, they're not particularly well connected to the professionals who can help them make sense of all of these changes. Like I think that you all are like have the skill set and the position to be able, you're exactly the people that people in their 20s and 30s need when they're starting to ask some of those really big questions about life in really important ways. Like, what am I doing here? How am I spending my time? What's the point of all this? I'm disconnected maybe from where I grew up because I went to college and then moved away and got a job, or I married a spouse and we moved to their city and whatever it is, or like I've been struggling to make friends. COVID has disrupted normal ways of getting together, blah, blah, blah. All the things and you're exactly the people that they need, but they're not turning to you in the ways that they used to. I think in part because they don't see institutions and institutional leaders as trustworthy. They're not likely to just walk through those doors in the way that previous generations would. TP said it this way: I don't really see the church as a resource. I don't really see it as something that is part of my thing to even tell people. If someone tells me, hey, I'm really down on my bills, I need help, I'm giving them resources to the local food pantry. I'm giving them resources to the local women's shelter. I'm giving them resources to the local health clinic. Churches just aren't on my radar as someone who is able to be a support and a resource for people who are in need. And I think that the local food pantry and the women's shelter and the health clinic are amazing places to direct people, as I'm sure you do. And many of your churches probably run these things or provide space for them. But as we all know, that's not the only thing going on in somebody's life when when they're food insecure, or when they're experiencing intimate partner violence, or when they're experiencing a health emergency. Those things need to be addressed in their immediacy. But there is also a spiritual care aspect. There's a community aspect that churches can help provide, that people are completely disassociating from these other things. They don't see the church as a resource to help them navigate those things in any particular way. And again, I think that we can not point everything back to the loss of trust, but I think that's a big part of what's happening here. Is that people are just skeptical of the institutions. I was giving a presentation to the Diocese of Arlington, Catholic Diocese of Arlington, just a few weeks ago, and there was a reporter there from their local Catholic newspaper and magazine, and he said, what do we have to do to get these? It was about young people. He said, what do we have to do to get kids come back in the doors? I was like, well, I think the first step is actually not to get them in, but that we have to go out, because their parents, as we see here, are just not particularly inclined to engage with the institutions. And so part of the answer is not sort of, can we change their minds and make them see us as a resource, but can we go out and actually be that resource that they need? We see this again. We asked about Jesus particularly because we're like, oh, wait, how toxic is the brand of Christianity? Is it about the institutions? Is it about the people, the beliefs, the teachings? Well, it turns out Jesus is really popular. Even among nuns, you see, Jesus still ranks above 6 on a 10-point scale, which is sort of a weird thing to shove Jesus into a sort of ranking system, like a popularity poll. Like, I wonder if Jesus could win homecoming queen or king. Based on a popularity contest. But I think the takeaway here is that relative to local congregations or institutional religion, what we find is that the figure of Jesus and the teachings there actually remain really popular. There's a lot that people like about somebody who is selfless, and somebody who is the embodiment of forgiveness and grace and all these good things. We also, again, just because nuns don't claim a religious affiliation, should not be extending this idea to them that they don't care. Because when we ask them about spirituality, well, that rises to also pretty high levels in terms of what they're concerned about and interested in. And I think that's a really critical finding here, where for so long, when we've conflated nuns with not caring, and this isn't the only research that shows that. It's pretty clear that there's a lot going on inside that box, that these people should not be sort of written off or marginalized. And it looks like we can find a little bit of purchase by leaning into the figure of Jesus as sort of central to the identity, as opposed to maybe the strength and power and longevity of the institution that is the church. It's not to say that we don't ever talk about church, and not to say that church is bad, but in terms of what's resonating with these people, it clearly seems that the figure of Jesus is probably a much more likely to have success than the institution of the church. You can argue that they shouldn't be separating those, that you don't separate those, that the two can't be separated. And I would be right there on your team for those arguments. But lots of people do make those distinctions. Okay, this is a key finding number 5 here. Parents are overwhelmingly confident in their ability to teach their kids to live meaningful lives. So we asked to see, we were working on this hypothesis of like, well, the church, like, parents need the church, right? Or, to help teach their kids virtues and values and all the good things in life, and like answer some of life's biggest questions and provide purpose and meaning. But it turns out that parents actually, whether they need it or not, they definitely do not think that they do. uh, so like over 80% of parents are pretty dang sure that they got this, that they can handle teaching their kids the skills that they need to live a life filled with meaning and purpose. So if we were thinking, for example, that we might build programs around how to live a purposeful life, or how to live a meaningful life, and that would attract parents to bring their kids back to church, quite possibly the answer to that is like not going to be successful as we might have thought that it would be. Where I do think we find, though, some like a pathway forward, again, so Jesus is one of those, the figure of Jesus. It's also the values that Jesus embodied that show up in many of our religious teachings. Now there's an issue here that we're going to see, but we're seeing some, I think, a pretty important point of contact, or potential point of contact, here in finding 6, the last of our findings. Parents think that virtues are essential for their kids. They really think that this is among the most important things that they can do for their kids, which is to sort of like pass down or imbue these virtues to their children. But you can see here, and what I like this tool. We use it a lot to call this this gap analysis, where in the blue line, what you've got is how much, we ask them, how much do you think the church emphasizes or teaches these things? In the green line, what you've got is how important is this value to you? And of course, like, I mean, the green line is not really, I mean, no parent says values are unimportant to them. They all say it at some level. And so the real key is in the difference between them. So, for example, at the top, parents say, 70% of parents say that self-control is really important virtue to be able to pass along to their kids, or to raise them, to get them to embody themselves. But they think that the church, only 48% said that they think that the church emphasizes this value. That's a 20% gap on something that's incredibly important to parents. 75% of parents think that love is important, but only 54% say that the church emphasizes love. The 21% gap on something they think is really important, and a 21% gap on patience and kindness and joy. And then you can see on down the list. We don't have to necessarily belabor every single one of these. I mean, sadly, I think that as we look at the very bottom right there, only 60% of parents say that faithfulness is really important to them. But that is the highest blue line. They think that mostly, in other words, what the church is concerned with teaching and emphasizing is how to be devout to the church, or to the teachings and beliefs of the church. And that's important. People should want, people working in the church should want to create, raise, support faithful people. But it's kind of, I think it's telling that these young adult parents in our study, when we stack that up with all the other values here, they see the institutional one as the one that the church is the most concerned with, and that the others are sort of secondary to that. So I think, again, it paints this picture that maybe there's a perception out there, if I were to sum all this up, that the church is maybe out in it for itself, not necessarily in it for the individual people. But again, we see in this, just like when we start, like, okay, where's the thread through all this, and we start to understand, like, well, nuns are actually way more interested in faith and spirituality than we might have previously thought. Like, that is a mission field. They are not like lost and gone to us, inaccessible to us. There's also like this notion that, okay, well, if the institution is important to them, Jesus still is, and spirituality still is. And even the way that those things funnel through to values and virtues is. And there's a whole lot that we can do in the church around those things. It's just that so many of our current models are still based in this high trust world assumption, where we're sort of walking around as an institution thinking that it's still 1965 when everybody trusts institutions. So we keep building these institutional expressions. We try to get people through the doors. We try, to try and, be the authoritative voice on a particular issue, as opposed to recognizing that we're now operating in this new low trust environment. And those old high trust tools are not bad, they're just less effective now. And this really seems to be calling for a shift that is more relational, that is more individual, that is, not compromising on the truth of your faith, but that is really reaching people where they're at, so they see the church and church leaders as a real resource in times of need. So I think we see in here um, some of what this last section about future directions. So I think it's incumbent and really important for us to see parents as part of the mission field, not necessarily part of the fold. Last data point here for us. We asked even parents who are currently we asked people, obviously, like, are you currently going to church? But then we asked this really important question, which was, do you think that you'll still be going to church in 5 years? And we asked them, like, another way of asking this in a separate survey was, do you think that they'd still be going to church once their kids leave high school? Because there's been this like long-standing pattern that I think a lot of pastors and ministers and other professionals are still operating under, which is that there is this sort of standard way of going through life, which is that you grow up in the church, you go away to college, you maybe fall away in your early 20s as you move away, and you're trying to find yourself, and then you get married and have kids, and then that brings you back to church, and now we got you. Now you're back here, and yes, of course, now your kids are off on that like pattern, but we have you, and you're going to stick around even after your kids go. Now that pattern, which I think is pretty almost like a cliche to say, that there is some reality to that in the past. It has never been as true as people would have liked to believe, and it's even less true now than most people think. Our data here says that not only is that pattern not likely to hold, but that parents are actually intending to leave. Even the ones that currently are there for their kids are actually making active plans to leave once their kids graduate. And that is kind of alarming, because I think a lot of our institutional assumptions built on that model mean that once we get parents to come back by offering really great children's programming, or let's face it, even just an hour a week of rest so that somebody else is watching their kids or whatever it is, then we sort of stop paying much attention to their needs, because we feel like, oh, well, now they're back and they'll be back forever. And we know that people have sort of drifted away. What I think is kind of maybe alarming, but really different about these findings is that parents are they're making active plans to leave. So we shouldn't think that just because like kids come back, like these people do have kids and they come back and get baptized, that now we have them more or less for life after a brief interruption between their own high school years and their parenting years. That doesn't seem like it's going to be the case. The second future direction, which I don't have much of an answer for here, I know this presentation was mostly about parents, but just to note back to that original slide, something like 40% of 25 to 39-year-olds either didn't have kids or were not planning to have kids. And so that means that there are a whole lot of people running around out there that are sort of, I don't want to say they're evading or eluding our efforts, like they're sort of like we're chasing them and they're like running around trying to get away. I mean, like a lot of the ways that we've thought about reaching people in their late 20s and 30s has primarily been through the family, because the vast majority of people in their late 20s and early 30s either had families or were trying to. We might need to think about opening up some pathways and doors and avenues to make sure that our churches are relevant, even for people. What looks like we're going to have is a pretty significant cohort of people moving through who are childless, maybe coupled, maybe single, but not necessarily with children. So those would be the two sort of like key things that I want us to keep in mind moving forward. Okay, that brings us to the end here. What happens when nuns have kids? You can see the PDF, download the results, continue discussion. If I had one like thing to say to close this out, is like, that's a lot of data. Just saw a lot of data. None of it is as important as you sitting down with a young adult parent and having a conversation with them. That matters more than any of these data points and any of the things that I've just talked about. So that would be my encouragement for you, is if you wanted to take a first step based on this presentation, talk to somebody. Talk to somebody in their 20s in your community. Find out what their challenges and struggles are. See if they'll introduce you to a friend that doesn't go to your church or isn't in your community, so you can begin to broaden out your own perspectives, because I think there's a lot more going on than there has been maybe in previous generations. All right, I'd love to. I see that the chat's been going. I'd love to see some of these Q&A things. Nima, happy to answer whatever is most salient here.
Yes, first, let me thank you for your presentation. I'm so grateful for your ministry and your research that you've done. The chat was on fire with a lot of questions, a lot of great comments came out of the chat as well. And so thanks to our tech deacons who were able to organize it all for me.
Yes, thank
We
you.
have some order to these questions. So depending on time, we might not get to them all. So I'll lift up a few out of the 2 pages of questions that we have so far. And the first I'll lift up are questions about the research process.
Sure.
The question I want to pose to you is number one, if there was a question that would have applied, did you see religious trauma come up as a factor for young parents? Did you see religious trauma come up for a factor for young parents?
Yeah, so I think it's embedded in some of those interviews. And if there was like a thing, I mean, it's a really important question because it's one of those areas that for a lot of people, like if you've been through it, if you've experienced religious trauma, it then is a piece of every story that you tell about religion and faith. It could also be its own story, but you're probably never going to be able to tell any component of a story about religion and faith that doesn't include your own trauma. I mean, that's the nature of trauma. So we were reluctant to like we went back and forth about this because we were reluctant to open up that line of questioning directly because we didn't feel like we would do it justice because it is, like we said, it is its own thing. But I think you can see, especially in some of those qualitative comments, that yeah, there are a lot of people carrying around a fair amount of baggage here. And all I would say, very rarely have I ever heard of somebody claiming religious trauma that wasn't justified. I mean, maybe I've never heard of it. It seems legit. Like I said that we have the decline of institutional trust is a forest level issue, but that does not mean that people haven't done things in their individual trees to advance that decline of trust. Um, and so
Okay.
there is likely some real repair work that needs to be done with some individuals.
Noted for us faith leaders. Thank you so much. I'll pose 2 more questions in this um, topic around the research process. The next question is, does this research include people who have a Christian background who would check Christian on a form, but do not participate in a faith community for themselves or their children?
Yes, so that would be the inactive affiliates that we saw in one of the early slides. We certainly ask questions about both of those things. But for us, religiosity for social scientists is really broken down into a few dimensions. So practice is one of them. Affiliation, so practice, like do you go to church? Affiliation, or for us, mosque, synagogue, etc. Affiliation is, do you claim an affiliation? Do you identify yourself that way? And then belief is the third component of what we would all wrap up into religiosity. And any one of those, I mean, any of those dimensions can float independently of the others. So you can have people with really strong belief, that line up with Christian beliefs who don't attend and also don't claim to be Christian. You can have people obviously who are Christian and they'll claim the affiliation and not go to church and have the belief. So any of those combinations you can imagine exist in the world and likely even exist in your pews.
Okay, thank you. All right, for the sake of time, I know some might need to stop and jump off the call, but we will continue on with a few more questions. 2 that I think are really helpful. There's someone who said they're curious about the socioeconomic status and the racial and ethnic groups represented in the study. Can you speak more to that, Josh?
Yeah, so the study is I'm trying to remember so I get this right. So it's census weighted, which means that we take the US Census and we ask our company that's providing the panel of respondents to match for region, age, well in this case not age because it's 25 to 39, but region, race and gender. So that we match the profile of the country for those dimensions. And then obviously we're restricting this one by 25 to 39-year-olds. So economic status, we did not ask. It's an incredibly difficult thing to measure because people often don't know their individual or household income at all. So it's the way that the most reliable way to measure something like socioeconomic status involves more than one question. You really need to ask sort of a bank of questions about it, and you only get so much time and space. And so rather than be misleading by just picking one number, we used our time on other questions.
Okay. And anything about the ethnic background of the folks that were
We measured it in the
in
same
the
way
study?
as the census,
Census.
which currently treats race and ethnicity as two separate categories, especially for white and Hispanic people. Where
All
white
right.
is race is, yeah, and Hispanic is ethnicity.
All
But
right.
so
Let's
again,
go.
should be balanced and matches the country.
Got it. Okay. Thank you. All right. This
Oh,
question
and one
is,
thing I'll say is
oh,
that
yes, go ahead.
really critically, I think in the inside of those data is that we of course did analysis by breaking these all down by various demographic groups. There were not so significant differences that they warranted like their own study. I mean, every all of these like demographic nuances are important in their own right. But in a general presentation like this, it wasn't like anything jumped out that was like, oh, this group is so different on this one variable that we had to call it out. The one that we actually suspected might matter most was actually age. That is it really right to think of a 27-year-old in the same way as a 37-year-old? I mean, a lot happens. And there were some minor differences, but what mattered more was stage rather than age. So if you have kids and how old they are, or if you don't have kids yet, those people tended to be more like each other than age. Age was not the predictor there. Stage mattered more.
All right. Thank you. The last question in that segment is, what understanding of Jesus is popular? The social justice Jesus, the eternal salvation Jesus, or is there another understanding of Jesus?
There's only one Jesus. Everybody agrees on exactly what that is, right, Nima? No, I love this question. I think it's the right one, and we should push on the PCUSA higher ups to fund round 4 of the study, because I think that's exactly the right next question to be asking is like, okay, well, if Jesus is so popular, what exactly does that mean? What are people thinking about when they think about Jesus? We didn't expect, if we had known that finding would have come out, we would have dug into it more, but it was actually asked in that third wave. So remember, we did interview survey. This is a question from that second batch of surveys that we had added in based on what we had been hearing, but we didn't have a chance to unpack it.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for that. So that could be something that we do when we have young nuns in our church to
Yeah.
find them out. All right, well, let's move on. Now we have questions about the interpretation of the research. And so here's one question that I thought was helpful for us all to hear. Both Pew and Barna have identified a plateau of membership loss in the last 4 years. Can you talk about what this means?
You bet. And you may have seen even there was a Christianity Today article out yesterday about some Barna data that just came out talking about Gen Z as being the most, what do they call them, the most religiously engaged generation or something like this. That I don't want to get it's. Okay, I'd like to. I want to give this question its honor, but I also don't want to get into it like a nerd fight here. So I'll try and be succinct, Nima. Though, if you think more explanation, you know this audience a little better than I do, I'm sure. If you think more details warranted, please ask a follow up.
Okay.
Yes, it's plateauing. But I think largely what we're seeing here is that the people who were sort of barely engaged all these years have now actually are just not engaged at all. So I don't want to be like the wet blanket at this party, because the reality is like I really do see a lot of hope. I mean, I have there's all kinds of good work that we could be involved in. I wouldn't be here and doing this work with TriTank in this ecumenical group if it weren't for the amazing things that PCUSA is already doing through 1001 New Worshiping Communities, for example, and in other places. Those are the things that I think are the real signs of revitalization and renewal, not necessarily looking at these old markers and saying like, well, they're not as bad as they used to be. So like, the church is getting better. So I think a lot of what we're seeing there is like, yeah, so church membership isn't declining as fast. That's because all the people who were members who were going to leave have already left. We're not necessarily getting a whole lot of new members. Like, the finding that came out yesterday was talking about, was Barna data talking about Gen Z being, they go to church more than any other generation, but that's not entirely true. If you read that data, if you read that closely or even cursorily, I think you'll see smart people will understand that was just church going people. So the data are actually saying that church going people in Gen Z go to church more often than church going people, of other generations. Um, well, there are fewer church-going people in Gen Z because there's like what we've got is this Gen Z is really the first generation that they didn't become nuns. They've been raised as nuns. Their parents became nuns. Like that, their parents left the church. These emerging generations now have been raised with no church. So whereas before, maybe you would have identified as Christian and gone to church 2 or 3 times a year, and so that would have pumped up those affiliation and attendance numbers. Well, now they're just not doing that at all. And so it looks like, maybe there's something really cool going on. I think there is something really cool going on. I don't think that's what it is.
Thank you. I think that was great, a response. Thank you.
Okay.
I do want to ask this question, then I'll move on from this category. This was asked during the affiliation slide showing participation in religious services. So hopefully you can go back to that thought. So this person says, so if I understand this correctly, this is showing that the parents are simply matching their values with their activity in the church.
I think that is the danger, is that parents are, if I was sort of, I'm inclined to be optimistic because I believe in the good news myself. I am not just a sociologist of religion, I'm a religious sociologist. But I'll admit that there are times when I look at data and it's hard to sort of see the pathway through it. And where I get concerned is that parents are maybe putting church into the same sort of like array of activities as other resources that they have for parenting, that the church is simply a service provider. Sports
Mm.
can build character and provides a place for you to gain some, motor skills and some understanding of how your body works. And school is a place to develop your mind, and like church is a place where values happen. And like yes, church is a place where values happen, but I think we would all agree that, at least from our perspective, there's something way more transcendent and transformational going on at church. Now, I don't think, now where we might depart on that is like, I don't think that's the parents' fault. Like, I understand why they see church that way. I think that's a shift or a perspective that we really have to fight against. This isn't just one among many things. Like, you could teach your kid how to play violin, or you could teach them about, Abrahamic faiths, Christianity in particular. This is the thing, right? And we I think should not abdicate that space. Even as it erodes around us, we should fight to maintain it.
All right, noted. Another noted. Thank you. All right, let's move to questions on interpretation of general sociological trends.
Sure.
This question I thought was really helpful. It says, I'm curious if there are any institutions or cultural phenomena, social spaces, podcasts, where trust has gone up in the past few decades.
This is a great question. So I'll say two things here. What I share in a lot of presentations, we just didn't have time here. It's not, and so I'm glad that this question comes up, is in that slide that I showed with the big down arrow and the gap between trust in the 70s and trust in today. What we could fill in the middle there, instead of a down arrow, is the way each of those industries or segments or institutions has responded. So, for example, as we lose trust in big business and even in big agriculture, Walmart and Costco are now the largest purveyors of local and organic food in the country. That is a way that institution has responded to this forest level trend, right? As we've lost faith in traditional sort of mainstream media, to use what it is tantamount to a swear word for some people, we've seen the rise of all these niche media sources, all the way down to now. Just when you thought it couldn't get any more micro, it just gets more micro. And now people don't even follow alternative channels. They follow people to give them their news on YouTube, influencers. People don't trust Congress, but they trust the person they voted for. So, every one of these industries, in other words, has come up with something new to fill in that trust gap. We've seen a rise of holistic medicine. We've seen the rise of alternative banking and cryptocurrency, and on and on and on. The one place where I often struggle to fill in that gap is with the church. There are things that are starting to emerge, but there just hasn't been this like oh, we figured it out, it's this. Like, we're going to move to like a shorter, contemplative services every night instead of, fighting to retain this institutional position of Sunday morning. Like, for example, I'm not even saying you should. I'm just saying like that would be one example of a thing you could fill in that gap with. I can't think of this. We're still in the very early stages where other industries, I think, have responded much more effectively, frankly, to that social trend. The second thing I'll say is that we at Future of Faith, we have done some of our own research. We're really interested in the power of listening and what listening does for faith formation in particular. And
Mm.
you can see all that data if if this wasn't enough data for you, you can go to our website, you can see all that. It's all free. The
Want to give a shout out to the website really quickly?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry, it's futureoffaith.org. Futureoffaith.org. Thank
Okay.
you. One of the questions we asked in there, of course, was how much you trust all these institutions, teenagers, adults, doesn't matter, they don't trust them. But then we said, how much do you trust somebody that you have a relationship with? And that number is incredibly high. Like up over 3/4 of people say that they have high levels of trust for somebody they have a relationship with, and low levels of trust for institutions and institutional leaders. And I think what we're seeing in that is just a continuation of all these other data points, really, that trust hasn't disappeared. It's just been relocated down to
Mm.
something that is much more personal, much more contextual, much more individual. And when we ask sort of like a future casting question of like how much does artificial AI essentially make you less trustworthy of what you see online? We saw people getting increasingly skeptical of the stuff that they see online, which means the future is likely to push towards that personal relational direction even more.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I have a follow-up question that I think might be helpful here from a new question in the chat, which says, thought the slide articulating that young parents don't look to the church to help with needs was interesting, i.e. food pantry, women's shelter would be the default referral. And I wonder how this aligns with the movement towards specialization. For example, going to the family doctor for everything isn't so popular, but many kids have ENTs, respiratory therapists, etc. And perhaps the broad, big ways the church can walk with families and young adults isn't seen as specialized. So perhaps this is kind of speaking to what you're naming here in terms of the ways that we can name for folks what we do well in our ministry contexts.
I think that's right, Nima. Like I think that somewhere along the line, being that cultural hub, especially for underrepresented and minority communities in this country who are under-resourced, the church was often a place where it was the only place that you could go in some neighborhoods to figure out even where the services that were available to you might exist. And that started off as I think an expression of our faith in public in its best way of like Jesus calls us to live out our faith in these very public ways and to be good, a source of good in the world. I would I don't have I'm not going to speak authoritatively here, so I want you to hear this as a hypothesis, but I would suspect that somewhere along the way, because of a combination of attention and politics and dwindling resources coming from passing the plate, that those kinds of things ended up becoming an end in and of themselves, not an expression, not only an expression of our faith in the world, but they became instrumental to keeping the doors open in some ways,
Mhm.
um, and and we didn't do a very good job of claiming and holding on to that first message, and so people then began to see us as just service providers. Uh,
Mm.
Now that that is increasingly untenable, the church cannot continue to play that role in the same way that it has in the past. Something like 30% of churches are going to close in the next 10 years, for example, by most projections. And the funding is drying up, and lots of places can't even give funding for social services to a religiously affiliated organization, and on and on and on as federal money dries up for a lot of those things. I think you're right. Like we haven't held on to that special claim of, okay, you want a specialized life, fine. The thing that you come here for is meaning. Like the most specialist of all the special things, which is
Yes.
why do we
Yeah.
do any of this stuff? Why am I here?
Mhm.
We're the only ones who can answer that or help you to answer that. I mean, we're not answering it for you. I think in most cases, it's good
Walking
accompanying.
alongside folks as they discover it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Mhm. Absolutely. All right, two more questions. I'm gonna try to push us through so that we can ask the rest of these questions. They're so good. Um, And we'll move quickly. Is the decline in birth rate and planning to have children consistent across racial, ethnic, and economic groups?
No, certainly not. People, this is very much bimodal, meaning like what we would say is that there's two ways of this going on. So people who are economically insecure, who don't know what their future looks like, they are now increasingly less likely to have kids. Um, Even though they often have kids at a higher rate than other groups, they're less likely than they were in the past, and they're less likely to have as many kids as they once previously did, because how are you going to pay for all of this, right? Like, I have one kid. This is expensive. Um, and people who are on the other end of the spectrum are, who are very well off, are often they are often well off, the sort of upper middle class and above, because they have pursued and been able to pursue college degrees, plural. So, think masters and PhDs, to get good jobs that have, in many cases, sort of precluded them then from wanting to have kids at an early age. And then, the longer you go without having kids, statistics show the less likely you are to have them, to even want to have them. And then obviously biology starts to play a real role with the ability to have them. So we're finding the softening really at those two ends.
All right. Let's go to this next one. It says, I notice how many of the worries are events that happen to kids, acts of violence, etc. It looks like an underlying dynamic is a sense that parents don't have agency. Could you speak to this with your research?
I think that's probably true. I mean, nobody will be surprised to understand that the social life of American families has changed dramatically in this country. It was once possible for, that you could raise a family, not just a kid, but an entire family on one income in this country. Now more and more women are in the workforce, which is great, and they should definitely have the ability to do that. I guess some people would argue against that, but I mean, where it's not real, they're not our concern in this conversation. As women have entered the workforce over the last 30 years in big numbers, it has now become necessary that they work. And there's a whole lot of factors that go into that. Some of that is the low minimum wage that was stagnant for so long. Some of that is the increased consumerism and expectations in America. And we don't have time to unpack all that. But certainly all that, the sort of composition of the American family plays a role. So parents have less time to spend with their kids and feel less agency over it. Although I think there is this other thing going on, which is sort of hidden in all of this, which is that, and there's really fascinating research about this. I haven't done it, but some of my sociological and psychological colleagues have done it. Is that Americans just worry about the wrong things. I mean, they spend a lot of time worrying about things that are not likely to happen. It's not that they never happen. It's just that they really are not very common, and they certainly don't match the level of concern that we have for them. So, things like, for example, most Americans are not very concerned about car accidents, but they're very concerned about gun violence. And the reality is that car accidents are far more likely to impact you than gun violence, and gun violence in particular is not evenly spread. So of course we should be concerned about gun violence. We should do whatever it is that we can do about it, but it doesn't mean that we should like not pay attention to the most dangerous thing that your kids are probably going to do, which is drive to school, or drive to their friend's house on a Friday night. So anyway, you can dig into that. There's lots of great stuff online. So I would say a lot of times what keeps parents up at night is not even the stuff that should keep parents up at night. I mean, it should be on their radar somewhere, but like not at the top.
Okay, now this next question, I'm going to actually merge two together. In our prompt earlier, we talked about what are the things that we're seeing, our challenges we were seeing in young parents, and we saw a lot of business and scheduling conflicts that were raised up by so many who listed them in the chat. And so the other question that I'm pairing it with is, did you ask parents about their spiritual lives and needs? Do they see the church as a place for their own spiritual nurture and not just for their children?
Oh, that's a good question. I can't remember if we asked that actually. We did ask them because we were so focused on what it meant for them as parents. I don't think we asked about their own spiritual life. I mean, I'll have to go back and look because now I'm curious about that answer.
Okay, that's a great question. Thank you for the person who put that in the chat. We appreciate you. I want to go now to another question that I passed up, but we have time for, I think, one more question, and then I'll give some share some observations with you that came through the chat. And this one is about the trust. And so were declines in trust levels significantly different depending on geography, or were they consistent across the board?
Consistent across the board. Yeah,
Okay.
this is because this trend has been geography does matter. I'm not going to pretend like it doesn't for certain things. But America, the United States of America, is a particularly mobile society. We would be more likely to see urban rural differences than regional differences in this regard. This trend has been in place for so long.
Okay. All right. Now let's move now. Let me make sure I got things in the chat. Okay, yes. All right. So let's move now to some of the observations that we wanted to lift up from the chat we thought you might want to engage.
Yeah.
Um, the first one is so many parents feel like they are doing it all alone, not living their family, having friends nearby, etc. Do you want to speak on that?
Ooh, I can speak from experience. I mean, yeah,
Okay.
as I mentioned, I was an academic, and you don't get really a lot of choice. There's only, in a given year, there's like 200 or 300 tenure track sociology jobs in the whole country, and then you have to be qualified, for whatever specialization. So you don't get a lot of choice of where you're going to live, and so we've moved twice as a family. Neither case were we near family, as we had our own kid, and man, that was hard. Like it was in
Mhm.
some ways it was great for us because we hadn't like we were never like we had good jobs, we had savings, so it wasn't like we didn't need childcare in that regard. But it would have been nice to have our families around to be able to celebrate with and go through
Make
the
memories.
holidays,
Hmm.
etc. Um
Hmm.
the so yeah, I think that stuff. I think parents do feel alone. I think that it's isolated and alone. And you look at some of them. Where have churches been successful with young adult parents? A lot of them have been conservative groups that target mothers. So you think about MOPS, for example, um,
Hmm.
has been has I think gotten quite a bit of traction in some communities. Um, the theology in the community there can be, I don't know, it's a mixed bag, but I think that's why you see those things. And so if people do start to see the church as a resource, perhaps it's because they have still some convening power with parents.
Hmm. All right, let's do this last one and then we'll close out our time. We're getting so close to 11:30, or my time is 11:30. So for the parents that I know, it is a struggle to connect with churches because the church treats them like a merit badge to be earned or someone to replenish the financial or volunteer hole that exists in that community. What can you do for us instead of how can the church show up well for them? So if you want to reflect on that, I know I have my own memory here. I was a young mother working in adjudicatory in the presbytery in my area, but went to a church. They didn't know me. I knew them. Had my baby in a stroller. She was still nursing, and they asked me to be on a committee. That was my first time there, and that's what they asked me to do. So we could think about the ways that we engage with young parents. How about for you?
Same. Like I'll tell you a big part of why we're at the congregation that we're at right now, which is an ELCA congregation. And my wife and I both grew up Lutheran, but what has kept us in this local congregation is she works for the local Youth for Christ chapter. Well, I guess now the National Youth for Christ, but has been very involved in youth ministry in our city. I do this job. I used to run I helped to found and then run Springtide Research Institute, which focuses on young people in faith, and then now do this research. And they never asked me to do anything. And I don't, it's not what I'm not saying. I don't hear me say like, don't ask young parents to do anything. It's that they understood me. Like they took the time to get to understand me. And, I've given a couple of presentations or something to leadership, but they very quickly understood us as a family because they took the time to get to know us and were like, oh, got it. Let's just see, if we can make this a space that you can engage as a family, not as having to be experts. Now, there are some people like get to know them, understand them. Maybe they want a leadership role, or they're looking like maybe they have a humdrum job and they really want a place where they can exercise that muscle. So I'm not saying that there's like a prescriptive outcome. I just mean that might be the prescriptive process, which is like take the time to get to know their each individual situations.
All right, now I'm going to lift up one last observation, and then but before I do that, I would love for those who are remaining right now in the webinar, if you would, what is something that you're going to take away from this presentation today? Would you add that in the chat? What is one insight that was lifted up here that you are going to take back to your church and mention that will be helpful for you all in ministry? So put that in chat, just engaging you all a little bit more. And then for you, Josh, I would like to give you this last observation before we close out. And that is, young families don't have time or money, but it seems to be that they need community. Something that I'm realizing and I was thinking was the low trust data is that as people disaffiliate from institution, they often seek those needs in a new non-institutional organization. Um, for example, are non-denominational churches without developed polity a way to access one's religious needs without participating in institutional religion in the same way that we PCUSA folks understand that category?
I think there's a lot of truth in that. I mean, you can look at, like, it's not that people have stopped wanting community. You can find ways and other instances where people have been wildly successful by leveraging community. I mean, one of the most popular examples here is CrossFit. There's exercise is still exercise. I mean, you're still moving weights and you're still running and like doing this thing. They never sold the exercise. They always sold it as this is a place where you come to be with other people who are also doing similarly insane things to their body,
Yes.
right? And you see that again, whether it's about music and festivals, or whether it's about exercise with CrossFit or Soul Cycle or whatever. Um, People have been figuring out ways to leverage for good, leverage for good, the need for community, and I think the church can do that too.
Yeah. Well, with that, I will just would like to say some closing statements. But the first one is thank you so much, Josh, for your wonderful presentation. That has been so helpful for us in ministry and the ways that we will move forward, sharing the love of Jesus Christ with others. And how we do that was definitely going to be important by what you have listed for us today. So thank you. And so I would like to thank you all for joining us today for session 1 of Holy Shift. We hope that this research and conversation sparks some new insights for you and those in your care and your ministry settings. But please don't forget that this coming Monday, September the 8th at 1 p.m. Eastern, we will have the Reverend Libby Tedder Hughes with us leading in conversations and helping us to reflect together to envision new ministries with young parents. And we look forward to seeing you there. So God bless you, God keep you, and we'll see you soon. Thanks so much.